The morning of November 1st, 1943. Simpson Harbor, Rabaul. Japanese ground crews worked frantically across 5 airfields as the largest single reinforcement of naval aviation in the South Pacific arrived overhead. Wave after wave of aircraft descended through tropical clouds, their engines roaring as they lined up for landing at Lakunai, Vunakanau, Rapopo, and Tobera. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Not the usual battered squadrons rotating in from forward bases. This was different. This was Operation RO, and it represented nearly the entire carrier air strength of the Japanese combined fleet being transferred to land bases. Over 100 elite carrier aircraft, flown by some of the Navy's most experienced aviators, converging on this single fortress. The pilots climbing down from their Mitsubishi A6M0s that morning believed they were Japan's answer to the American advance, creeping northward through the Solomon Islands. They had trained for years, mastered the art of aerial combat in the world's most maneuverable fighter, and now they would stop the enemy thrust toward Rabaul. The Navy had assured them they possessed every advantage. What they didn't know, couldn't know as they walked across those coral runways, was that the Americans had already deployed a new weapon specifically designed to kill Zeros. A fighter that would arrive over Rabaul within weeks, powered by an engine producing almost twice the horsepower of anything Japan could field. The F4U Corsair was coming, and its 2,000 horsepower would fundamentally rewrite the rules of air combat in the Pacific. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Rabaul occupied a position of extraordinary strategic importance by late 1943. Located on the northeastern tip of New Britain Island, it possessed one of the finest natural harbours in the South Pacific. Simpson Harbor could shelter dozens of warships, protected by the surrounding volcanic peaks and connected to 5 major airfields that turned the entire Gazelle Peninsula into an unsinkable aircraft carrier. The Japanese had seized Rabaul in January 1942, overwhelming a small Australian garrison. Over the following 20 months, they transformed it into the most heavily fortified position in the South Pacific. Approximately 110,000 troops garrisoned the base. 367 anti-aircraft guns ringed the harbour and airfields. Thousands of Japanese engineers had carved elaborate tunnel systems into the volcanic rock, creating bomb-proof storage facilities, command posts, and shelters that could withstand sustained bombardment. By mid-1943, Rabaul served as the linchpin of Japan's defensive perimeter. Aircraft staged through its airfields could reach across the Solomon Islands, threatening Allied operations as far south as Guadalcanal. Warships operating from Simpson Harbor could interdict supply convoys moving northward through the Solomons. The base represented Japan's last major stronghold, blocking the American advance toward the Philippines. But that defensive perimeter was collapsing. American and Allied forces had secured Guadalcanal in early 1943 after months of brutal fighting. They pushed northward through the central Solomons, capturing airfields at Munda and establishing bases in the Russell Islands. On November 1, 1943, the same day Operation RO aircraft arrived at Rabaul, American Marines landed at Empress Augusta Bay on Bougainville. That landing put Allied forces within 200 miles of Rabaul at the narrowest crossing. More critically, it meant American engineers could construct airfields on Bougainville that would bring Rabaul within range of land-based fighters. The fortress that had seemed impregnable in 1942 now stood exposed to sustained air attack. Admiral Minachi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, understood the threat. If Rabaul fell, Japan's entire defensive position in the South Pacific would unravel. The Americans would have a clear path to the Philippines, cutting off Japanese forces still fighting in New Guinea and throughout the Central Pacific. Losing Rabaul meant losing the war. Koga made a desperate gamble. He ordered Operation RO, stripping his carriers of their air groups and sending them to defend Rabaul. These weren't replacement pilots or hastily trained recruits. These were the elite carrier aviators of the First Air Fleet. veterans who had survived the catastrophic losses at Midway and the Philippine Sea. Their aircraft represented the cutting edge of Japanese naval aviation. Approximately 270 aircraft transferred to Rabaul between late October and early November. The majority were Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, the aircraft that had terrorized Allied pilots during the first year of the Pacific War. These Zeros mounted two 7.7mm machine guns in the engine cowling and two 20mm cannons in the wings. More importantly, they possessed legendary maneuverability and range that allowed them to escort bombers on missions.
Flight planners thought impossible.
The Zero had dominated Pacific skies in 1941 and 1942 through a combination of superior performance and brilliant tactics. Its Nakajima Sakai engine produced approximately 1,130 horsepower, driving the lightweight fighter to speeds around 330 miles per hour. But speed wasn't the Zero's primary weapon. The aircraft could outturn virtually anything the Allies flew at low speeds, and its climb rate of approximately 3,100 feet per minute allowed it to dictate engagement terms. Japanese pilots arriving at Rabaul in November 1943 flew with the confidence born of early victories. Many had combat experience dating back to China in the late 1930s. They had perfected tactics built around the Zero's strengths, using tight turning fights at low altitude where American fighters couldn't compete. They believed, with considerable justification based on 2 years of combat, that skill and maneuverability would overcome any American numerical advantage. The doctrine they flew under emphasized these principles. A fighter should be light, allowing maximum agility. It should possess long range to support offensive operations across vast ocean distances. Heavy armor was unnecessary weight that degraded performance. Self-sealing fuel tanks were similarly wasteful. A properly trained pilot wouldn't get hit in the first place, and if hit, armor wouldn't save him anyway. This philosophy had roots deeper than simple engineering choices. It reflected fundamental assumptions about what made an effective combat aircraft and what separated a superior air force from an inferior one. The Japanese believed that fighting spirit and pilot skill mattered more than industrial capacity. That elegant design reflected martial superiority. That Japan's limited resources demanded fighters built for quality over quantity. The Zero embodied these beliefs perfectly. Its empty weight of approximately 3,700 pounds was less than half that of contemporary American fighters. Engineers had achieved this through meticulous weight reduction, using thin aluminum carefully formed and assembled by skilled craftsmen. Every component was sized to minimum acceptable tolerances to save grams of weight. The result was an aircraft that could fly 1,900 miles on internal fuel, outturn any Allied fighter in service during early 1942, and climb to combat altitude faster than anything except specialized interceptors. For a brief window, these advantages had been decisive. Zeros destroyed Allied aircraft at ratios that approached 10-1 during the Philippines campaign and the Dutch East Indies fighting. But by November 1943, that window had closed. American pilots had learned the Zero's weaknesses through hard experience and captured examples. They knew it lost maneuverability above 260 miles per hour. They knew it couldn't maintain steep dives without risking structural failure. They knew its large propeller created high torque that made the aircraft roll much slower to the right than left. Most critically, they knew the Zero was fragile. The weight reduction that gave it such remarkable performance came at a terrible cost. The aircraft had virtually no armor protection. Its fuel tanks weren't self-sealing. A single burst from heavy machine guns could turn it into a fireball. As one American pilot observed, destroying a Zero was easy once you got it in your sights. The trick was getting it into your sights. The Americans had developed aircraft and tactics specifically designed to exploit these weaknesses while avoiding the Zero's strengths. They refused to fight turning battles at low altitude. Instead, they used superior speed and diving performance to attack from above, fire a quick burst, then climb away before the Zero could respond. These boom and zoom tactics neutralized the Zero's maneuverability advantage completely. but tactics alone couldn't overcome performance limitations. American fighters in service through 1942 lacked the speed and climb rate to execute boom and zoom attacks consistently. The Grumman F4F Wildcat was sturdy and well-armed but couldn't match the Zero's speed or climb rate. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk performed well at low altitude but struggled above 15,000 feet. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning had speed but complicated logistics and relatively poor low-altitude performance. What American pilots needed was a fighter that combined high speed, excellent climb rate, robust construction, and overwhelming firepower. An aircraft that could climb above Zeros, dive through their formations at speeds they couldn't match, absorb battle damage that would destroy Japanese fighters, and still make it back to base. That fighter was already in production by November 1943. The Vought F4U Corsair had entered combat in the Solomon Islands in February of that year, flown by Marine Squadron VMF 124, operating from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Its distinctive inverted gull wing made it instantly recognizable. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2-800 double Wasp engine made it lethal. The R2-800 produced 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, not the theoretical emergency power that would destroy the engine after a few minutes. 2,000 horses as sustainable combat output, hour after hour, sortie after sortie. This represented almost twice the power of the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine. That power margin transformed everything. The Corsair's climb rate exceeded 3,000 feet per minute in early variants, reaching 4,360 feet per minute in later models. This matched or exceeded the Zero's climb performance despite the Corsair weighing more than twice as much. In practice, the Corsair could outclimb Zeros at higher speeds and altitudes where combat typically occurred. Maximum speed told an even more dramatic story. The F4U-1 could reach 395 miles per hour at 19,000 feet. Later variants approached 420 miles per hour. This was 60 to 90 miles per hour faster than the Zero at combat altitudes. The speed advantage allowed Corsair pilots to engage or disengage at will. If a Zero pilot tried to run, the Corsair would catch him. If a Corsair pilot found himself outnumbered, he could simply dive away at speeds the sixth five-post. Zero couldn't safely match. The engineering that made this performance possible represented a completely different design philosophy than the Zero. Where Japanese designers obsessed over weight reduction, Grumman engineers built robust structures designed to survive carrier operations and combat damage. The Corsair's empty weight of approximately 9,200 pounds reflected heavy forgings, substantial framing, and thick skin panels that could absorb punishment. Behind the pilot sat approximately 240 pounds of armor plate, angled to deflect rounds coming from behind and below. The fuel tanks incorporated multiple layers of self-sealing materials that would expand and plug bullet holes within seconds of being punctured. The cockpit featured armored glass thick enough to stop rifle-caliber rounds from ahead. Everything about the Corsair screamed pilot protection over performance optimization. The armament package reinforced this philosophy. 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the wings, 3 per side, with ammunition capacity totaling 2,350 rounds. These guns fired at a combined rate of 4,800 rounds per minute. A 2-second burst would send 160 rounds downrange, enough to shred any Japanese fighter that flew. Later variants replaced the machine guns with 4 20mm cannons, providing even more devastating firepower. The Corsair could also carry bombs and rockets for ground attack missions, transforming from pure fighter to highly effective fighter-bomber when needed. This versatility made it invaluable for the island-hopping campaigns that characterized the Pacific War. All of this capability came from that massive R2-800 engine and the industrial infrastructure that could produce it in quantity with consistent quality. The engine alone weighed approximately 2,360 pounds, more than an entire Zero fighter had weighed just a few years earlier. Its 18 cylinders, arranged in 2 rows, displaced 2,800 cubic inches, almost 46 litres of displacement. Pratt & Whitney had achieved something Japanese engine manufacturers couldn't match. Reliable 2,000 horsepower output through superior metallurgy, precision manufacturing, sophisticated supercharger design, and robust cooling systems. The R2800 could run at full combat power for extended periods without the failures that plagued Japanese engines pushed to their limits. The supercharger system particularly demonstrated American technological advantages. The two-speed, two-stage design maintained high manifold pressure across a wide range of altitudes, giving the Corsair excellent performance from sea level to over 30,000 feet. Japanese superchargers were simpler, less effective, compromises driven by manufacturing limitations rather than optimal design. Manufacturing techniques visible throughout the Corsair reflected mass production capabilities Japan couldn't approach. Panel edges showed machine forming rather than handwork. Rivet patterns were perfectly consistent, suggesting automated assembly. Components were interchangeable in ways Japanese aircraft components rarely were. The Corsair had been designed from the beginning for rapid, high-volume production by workers who didn't need years of specialized training. By November 1943, Grumman was producing over 200 Corsairs monthly, with production still ramping up toward peak rates that would exceed 500 aircraft per month by late 1944. Additional production lines at Goodyear and Brewster would push total Corsair production past 12,000 aircraft by war's end. This was industrial capacity on a scale Japan simply couldn't match. The Japanese pilots flying into Rabaul that November morning had no way to comprehend what they faced. Intelligence reports mentioned new American fighters, but couldn't convey the reality of sitting in a cockpit with 2,000 horsepower at your command. Combat reports from frontline units described aircraft that could absorb extraordinary damage, but reports from traumatized pilots weren't engineering data. What the Japanese had at Rabaul was the largest concentration of elite naval aviation they could assemble. What the Americans were about to bring was a fighter specifically designed to kill everything the Japanese had sent. The collision between these forces would demonstrate in the clearest possible terms what happened when fighting spirit met overwhelming material superiority. The Japanese were about to learn that sometimes 2,000 horsepower mattered more than all the skill and courage in the world. The first sustained air battles over Rabaul involving Corsairs began in mid-December 1943. American engineers had worked with remarkable speed to construct Torokina Airfield on Bougainville, carving runways from jungle and coral in a matter of weeks. By December 17th, the field was operational, and Marine F4U Corsairs began flying combat air patrols and escort missions from a base just 230 miles from Rabaul. The initial strikes followed a pattern that would become grimly familiar to Japanese defenders. Formations of American bombers, typically B-25s or Navy torpedo bombers, would approach Rabaul escorted by mixed fighter groups. P-38s and P-40s from Army Air Force squadrons, F-6F Hellcats from Navy units, and increasingly F4U Corsairs from Marine squadrons. Japanese radar operators would detect the incoming raids and scramble defensive fighters. Zeros and other Japanese aircraft would climb to intercept, often achieving good position above the American formations. Then the fighting would begin, and Japanese pilots would discover that the tactics that had worked so brilliantly in 1942 no longer applied. On December 23, 1943, the first large-scale strike hit Rabaul with significant Corsair participation. The attack plan called for Army Air Force bombers to strike first, followed by fighters sweeping through to engage Japanese defenders. Approximately 40 Japanese fighters rose to meet them. The Americans claimed 30 destroyed in the resulting air battle, though Japanese records don't support numbers anywhere near that high. What the records do show is a pattern of engagement that favored the Americans completely. Corsair pilots refused to fight on Japanese terms. When Zeros attempted to lure them into turning battles at low altitude, the Marines simply kept their speed up and climbed away. When Japanese fighters tried to bounce Corsair formations from above, the Americans would split, dive to pick up speed, then zoom climb back to altitude using their superior power-to-weight ratio. The combat reports filed by Marine pilots reveal tactical sophistication built specifically around the Corsair's strengths. They operated in pairs or sections, covering each other in mutual support patterns, If one Corsair engaged a Zero, his wingman would position to attack any Japanese fighter trying to help. If Zeros got on a Corsair's tail, that pilot would dive to build speed, then pull up sharply. The pursuing Zero would try to follow in the climb and lose speed rapidly, as its lighter weight couldn't compensate for the Corsair's massive power advantage. First Lieutenant Kenneth A. Walsh of VMF 124 emerged as one of the early Corsair aces during the Rabaul campaign. Walsh had mastered boom and zoom tactics, using altitude advantage to position above Japanese formations, then diving through at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. He would fire a burst from his 650 caliber machine guns, typically getting strikes, then use his speed to climb away before any Zero could react. On August 30th, 1943, during fighting before the main Rabaul campaign, Walsh demonstrated the Corsair's capabilities in dramatic fashion. Leading a section of 4 Corsairs on an escort mission, his formation was jumped by approximately 50 Japanese fighters. Walsh shot down 4 Zeros in the engagement before his aircraft sustained damage, forcing him to ditch. He survived and was later awarded the Medal of Honor for this action and subsequent combat missions. Walsh's tactics became standard throughout Marine Corsair squadrons. Never attempt to turn with a Zero at speeds below 200 knots. Always maintain energy advantage through speed or altitude. Use the Corsair's superior diving performance to escape unfavorable situations. Press attacks from positions of advantage. Fire concentrated bursts from the devastating 6-gun armament, then disengage before the fight becomes a slow-speed turning contest. The mathematics of these engagements were brutally simple. A Zero pilot who got behind a Corsair couldn't keep up in a dive. The Corsair would accelerate to speeds where the Zero's controls became mushy and ineffective, then pull away. A Corsair pilot who got behind a Zero didn't need to follow it through turns. He could use superior speed to position for another high-speed pass, attacking repeatedly until the Zero made a mistake or ran out of maneuvering room. Japanese pilots quickly recognized they were facing something qualitatively different from earlier American fighters. The Wildcat had been slow enough that Zeros could force turning engagements. The P-40 lost performance rapidly above 15,000 feet. The P-38, while fast, was less maneuverable and had logistics problems that limited its numbers. The Corsair combined advantages across every category that mattered: speed, climb rate, diving performance, firepower, and durability. There was no aspect of air combat where the Zero held a decisive edge except slow-speed turning, and Corsair pilots simply refused to fight that way. Combat reports from Japanese pilots stationed at Rabaul during late 1943 and early 1944 reflect growing desperation. They described American fighters that seemed to ignore the fundamental rules of aerial combat. Zeros would achieve perfect position, diving on Corsairs from above and behind, only to watch the American aircraft simply accelerate away at speeds Japanese fighters couldn't match. When Japanese pilots did manage to get guns on target, the results were often dismaying. The 50 caliber rounds and 20mm shells that should have destroyed American aircraft frequently failed to bring them down. Corsairs would absorb hits that would have turned a Zero into a fireball, then continue fighting or limp back to base trailing smoke but still flying. One frequently repeated account describes a Corsair taking multiple 20mm cannon hits to the fuselage and wings during a January 1944 engagement over Rabaul. The pilot reported strikes he could see, damage to control surfaces, and what sounded like significant structural hits. He dove away, using his speed advantage to escape pursuing Zeros, then flew the 100+ miles back to Torokina. The aircraft landed safely, and ground crews counted over 20 individual bullet and cannon shell impacts. The Corsair was repaired and returned to service within days. Contrast this with what happened when a Zero took hits from 650 caliber machine guns, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds at a combined rate of 4,800 rounds per minute. The typical result was catastrophic. Unprotected fuel tanks would ignite immediately. The lightweight structure would come apart under the hammering impact of multiple heavy bullets. Control surfaces would be shot away. Zeros didn't gradually deteriorate in combat. They exploded, burned, or simply disintegrated. The engineering realities behind these outcomes were clear to anyone who understood aircraft design, but Japanese doctrine had spent years denying their importance. The Corsair's 240 pounds of armor plate stopped rifle-caliber rounds completely and could defeat 20mm shells at typical combat ranges. The self-sealing fuel tanks would plug bullet holes before significant fuel loss occurred. The robust construction, using heavy forgings and thick skin panels, could absorb battle damage and maintain structural integrity. The Zero had none of these protections. Not 1 ounce of armor protected the pilot. Fuel tanks were simple aluminum cells that would ignite if hit by tracer rounds. The lightweight structure, so carefully optimized for minimum weight, failed catastrophically when subjected to heavy weapons fire. Japanese pilots were flying death traps, and they knew it. Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, commanding Marine Squadron VMF 214, led his Black Sheep Squadron in some of the most intense fighting over Rabaul during January 1944. Boyington's aggressive tactics and the Corsair's superior performance combined to produce remarkable results. During an 84-day combat tour, VMF 214 destroyed or damaged 203 enemy aircraft while losing relatively few of their own. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Boyington himself achieved 22 confirmed victories flying the Corsair, adding to the 6 he had scored earlier with the American volunteer group in China. His tactics emphasized aggressive pursuit, using the Corsair's speed and climb rate to press attacks even when outnumbered. On January 3, 1944, while leading a raid on Rabaul, Boyington was shot down and captured by Japanese forces. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner but survived to receive the Medal of Honor after repatriation. The squadron he left behind continued the systematic destruction of Japanese air power over Rabaul. Marine Fighting Squadron 215, VMF 215, achieved even more spectacular results during their combat tour. Between November 1943 and January 1944, they were credited with destroying 137 enemy aircraft, 4th highest total in Marine Corps aviation history. First Lieutenant Robert Murray Hanson of VMF 215 became the most successful Corsair pilot in terms of rapid victory accumulation. Between August 1943 and February 3, 1944, Hanson shot down 25 Japanese aircraft, 20 of them during a 17-day period in January 1944. On January 14th, during a strike against Japanese shipping in Simpson Harbor, Hanson destroyed 5 Zeros in a single mission, despite being separated from his squadron and fighting alone against superior numbers. Hanson's success reflected both exceptional pilot skill and the Corsair's overwhelming performance advantages. He could engage multiple opponents simultaneously because he controlled engagement terms completely through superior speed and climb rate. If pressed, he could dive away at speeds Japanese fighters couldn't match. When he achieved advantageous position, his 650 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower that destroyed targets with short bursts. On February 3, 1944, Hanson was leading an escort mission for torpedo bombers attacking Tobera airfield near Rabaul when his aircraft crashed into the sea. He was last seen descending toward a lighthouse, possibly attempting a strafing run. Hanson was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His 25 victories in just over 5 months of combat operations demonstrated what a skilled pilot in a superior aircraft could achieve. The cumulative effect of these operations was catastrophic for Japanese naval aviation. The elite carrier pilots sent to Rabaul during Operation RO were being systematically destroyed, not through superior Japanese fighting spirit or better tactics, but through simple material superiority. The Americans had aircraft that could outperform Japanese fighters in every category, except one that didn't matter because American pilots refused to fight that way. Japanese commanders at Rabaul understood what was happening, but lacked options to counter it. They tried concentrating fighters to achieve numerical superiority, sending formations of 40, 50, sometimes 60 aircraft against smaller American groups. But numbers didn't overcome the performance differential. Corsair pilots would use their speed advantage to pick off stragglers and isolated aircraft, while avoiding unfavorable engagements against concentrated Japanese formations. They tried using clouds and weather to set up ambushes, hoping to negate the American altitude advantage. Sometimes this worked, particularly when experienced Japanese pilots could lure individual Corsairs into slow-speed fights. But these successes were exceptions, and they came at terrible cost. For every Corsair shot down through such tactics, Japanese formations were losing 10, 15, sometimes 20 aircraft. By late January 1944, Japanese air strength at Rabaul was collapsing. The elite carrier air groups that had arrived in November were being bled white. Replacement aircraft and pilots couldn't keep pace with losses. The Americans were flying multiple raids daily, maintaining constant pressure that prevented Japanese forces from recovering between attacks. The situation became so desperate that surviving Japanese pilots began resorting to ramming attacks when ammunition ran out or when their aircraft sustained too much damage to continue fighting conventionally. These kamikaze-style tactics occasionally destroyed American aircraft, but represented the ultimate admission of helplessness. Pilots who had to ram their opponents weren't fighting. They were dying because they lacked any other option. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The engineering analysis that Japanese technical personnel conducted on captured American aircraft told the same story the combat reports were screaming. When recovery teams managed to salvage relatively intact Corsairs from crash sites, the aircraft were transported to Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal for detailed examination. Engineers who had spent the war designing lightweight fighters optimized for maneuverability found themselves examining an aircraft built on completely opposite principles. The Corsair was heavy, brutish by Japanese standards, built with a mass and structural strength that seemed wasteful until you understood the design philosophy behind it. The R-2800 engine dominated the examination. Japanese engineers had seen specifications on paper, but specifications couldn't convey the reality of components machined to tolerances. Their manufacturing facilities struggled to achieve consistently. The crankshaft was a massive forging that required machinery Japan's bombed-out factories couldn't produce. The connecting rods used advanced alloys Japanese industry couldn't source in adequate quantities. The pistons incorporated cooling galleries that managed heat loads Japanese engines couldn't handle. The supercharger system represented precision manufacturing at a level Japanese aviation had never achieved in mass production. Creating the compound curves and tight tolerances necessary for efficient supercharger operation required machine tools and quality control processes that Japan lacked. Engineers could understand the theory. They simply couldn't replicate it with available resources. The fuel system revealed another insurmountable advantage. The R-2800 employed sophisticated fuel injection that delivered consistent fuel flow regardless of aircraft attitude. This seemingly minor detail had profound combat implications that Japanese pilots understood viscerally. Corsairs could push over into negative G dives without their engines cutting out. Zeros had to roll inverted before diving to maintain positive G and keep their carbureted engines running. That half-second difference between maneuvers could mean life or death in combat. The self-sealing fuel tanks impressed Japanese engineers who had spent the war being told such protection was unnecessary weight. They cut into sample sections and discovered multiple layers of different materials, carefully designed to swell and plug bullet holes automatically. Tests using Japanese ammunition showed the system worked exactly as advertised, sealing punctures within seconds and preventing catastrophic fuel loss. The weight penalty for this protection was substantial, approximately 200 pounds per aircraft. But engineers examining combat loss reports understood that weight was a bargain. American pilots could take multiple hits to fuel tanks and still make it home. Japanese pilots in aircraft without self-sealing tanks would burn to death if a single tracer round hit their fuel cells. The armor protection throughout the Corsair told the same story. 240 pounds of steel plate positioned to protect the pilot from the most common threat vectors. Armored glass thick enough to stop rifle-caliber rounds from ahead. Construction designed to keep the pilot alive even when the aircraft sustained significant damage. Ballistic tests confirmed what combat reports had been indicating. The Corsair's armor could defeat 7.7mm rounds completely and would stop 20mm cannon shells at typical combat ranges, though with damage to the plate. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots sat in cockpits where even pistol-caliber rounds could prove lethal. The technical reports compiled at Yokosuka reached senior naval commanders in February 1944, with conclusions that were devastating in their clarity. The F4U Corsair represented a level of aircraft design and industrial capability that Japan could not match with available resources. Japanese pilots were being defeated not by superior tactics or greater skill, but by aircraft that embodied fundamentally superior engineering supported by industrial capacity Japan couldn't approach. The reports recommended immediate development of heavily armed interceptors with armor protection, even at the cost of the maneuverability Japanese doctrine had always prioritized. But by February 1944, such recommendations were academic. Japan's aviation industry was struggling under Allied bombing campaigns, material shortages, and loss of experienced manufacturing workers to military service. Even when Japanese designers managed to create aircraft incorporating lessons learned from examining the Corsair, production problems prevented them from reaching combat units in meaningful numbers. The Kawanishi N-1K2J Shiden Kai attempted to match some Corsair capabilities with armor protection, self-sealing tanks, and 4 20mm cannons. Test pilots praised its performance. Only about 400 were completed before war's end, and each required approximately 17,000 man-hours to build. The Mitsubishi A7M Repu, intended as the Zero's successor, incorporated heavy structure, armor, and powerful armament from the beginning. The first prototype didn't fly until October 1944, more than a year behind schedule. Engine development problems plagued the program. Only 8 were built before production ceased entirely. The material shortages underlying these failures reflected Japan's deteriorating strategic position. Self-sealing tanks required synthetic rubber compounds Japan couldn't produce in adequate quantities. Most rubber supplies had come from conquered territories in Southeast Asia. By 1944, American submarines had severed those supply lines almost completely. Armor plate required high-quality steel alloys that Japan's collapsing steel industry couldn't provide consistently. Even basic aluminum for airframes was becoming scarce. American B-29 raids beginning in late 1944 targeted aircraft manufacturing facilities systematically. The Musashino engine plant, one of Nakajima's primary facilities, was hit repeatedly. Production rates collapsed. Skilled workers were being drafted or killed in bombing raids, replaced by inexperienced laborers who couldn't maintain precision manufacturing standards. The Corsair had revealed a problem Japanese industry couldn't solve, not through better engineering, not through superior fighting spirit, not through any action available with existing resources. The gap between American and Japanese aviation by early 1944 wasn't closing. It was widening. Back at Rabaul, the consequences of this technological and industrial imbalance played out in the skies daily. By February 19, 1944, the last significant air battle over the fortress occurred. Allied aircraft found little shipping in the harbour and expended munitions against airfields instead. Losses were 1 Allied fighter versus approximately a dozen Japanese. 2 days earlier, Admiral Spruance had staged a highly successful raid on Truk, and the decision was made to withdraw most remaining Japanese aircraft from Rabaul. The air campaign was over. Total Japanese losses from November 1943 to March 1944 were approximately 359 aircraft. American and Allied combat losses were 136 aircraft. The kill ratio favored the Allies by more than 2.5 to 1, and this despite Japanese forces operating from well-defended bases with extensive anti-aircraft support. For the elite carrier pilots sent to Rabaul during Operation RO, the campaign had been catastrophic. Japan's most experienced naval aviators were lost over Rabaul, killed by American fighters that were simply better than anything Japan could field. The skills that had made these pilots elite in 1941 and 1942 couldn't overcome the material advantages American pilots possessed by late 1943. The fortress that Japan had spent 2 years building into an impregnable stronghold became a prison by March 1944. Rabaul still held approximately 70,000 Japanese troops, hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, and elaborate tunnel systems carved into volcanic rock. But its offensive capability had been neutralized completely. The air groups that were supposed to stop the American advance had been destroyed. Allied commanders made a strategic decision that would define the rest of the Pacific campaign. Rather than assault Rabaul directly, suffering the casualties that storming such heavily fortified positions would entail, they simply bypassed it. American forces continued their advance northward through the Bismarck Archipelago and westward toward the Philippines, leaving Rabaul isolated and impotent. The garrison that remained would sit out the rest of the war, cut off from supply, watching Allied aircraft fly overhead with impunity. What had been one of Japan's most important bases became what pilots called a milk run, a target so devoid of aerial opposition that missions there were used to give new aircrews combat experience in relatively safe conditions. The only opposition over Rabaul after March 1944 was anti-aircraft fire. Japanese fighters no longer rose to challenge American raids because there were no Japanese fighters left in adequate numbers, and sending the few that remained against overwhelming American air superiority was simply feeding pilots into a meat grinder. The Americans had won air supremacy so completely that Rabaul became a live-fire training range. For the Japanese pilots who survived the Rabaul campaign, the experience fundamentally altered their understanding of the war they were fighting. Men who had believed that skill and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages learned a brutal lesson. Sometimes superior engineering mattered more than courage. Sometimes 2,000 horsepower counted for more than all the training in the world. The psychological impact rippled throughout Japanese naval aviation. Pilots who rotated back to Japan or transferred to other combat zones carried with them knowledge of what the Corsair could do. They had watched elite aviators die in aircraft that couldn't protect them, couldn't match American performance, couldn't deliver enough firepower to reliably destroy enemy fighters, even when achieving perfect position. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, who led fighter units through 1943 into 1944, wrote in his private journal about the collapse of pilot morale. The entries, later recovered and excerpted in official reports, described men who knew they were flying to their deaths. They understood their aircraft couldn't protect them. They flew anyway because duty demanded it, but you could see the knowledge of inevitable death in their eyes before takeoff. This wasn't the fighting spirit that had carried Japan to early victories. This was fatalism born of facing insurmountable odds. When pilots know they're significantly outmatched by enemy equipment, when they understand that even perfect execution of tactics won't reliably produce victories, morale collapses regardless of training or indoctrination. The loss of experienced pilots at Rabaul created problems that cascaded through the entire Japanese Naval Air Service. These weren't replaceable assets. Training a carrier-qualified fighter pilot required years of instruction, hundreds of hours of flight time, and substantial fuel expenditure. By 1944, Japan lacked the fuel, time, and training infrastructure to replace losses. At anything approaching the rate combat consumed pilots. New pilots arriving at frontline units had received perhaps 100 hours of flight training, down from 300 hours or more earlier in the war. They were barely competent to fly their aircraft in peacetime conditions, let alone fight in them against experienced American aviators flying superior equipment. These inadequately trained pilots died even faster than their better-prepared predecessors, creating a death spiral where mounting losses forced even more abbreviated training, producing even less capable pilots who died even more quickly. American pilot training, by contrast, was expanding and improving. New aviators arriving in the Pacific by late 1944 typically had over 300 hours of flight time before seeing combat. They had practiced gunnery until they could hit targets consistently. They had learned formation flying until it became second nature. They had trained specifically in tactics designed to leverage their aircraft's strengths against known Japanese weaknesses. The industrial capacity that produced superior aircraft also produced superior pilots through systematic training programs that Japanese infrastructure simply couldn't match. America was fighting a war of production, churning out aircraft, pilots, ships, and weapons at rates that overwhelmed anything Japan could field. The Corsair symbolized this approach perfectly, a fighter designed not for elegance or minimum weight, but for mass production, pilot protection, and overwhelming combat effectiveness. By mid-1944, Grumman was producing Corsairs at a rate exceeding 500 per month. Goodyear added hundreds more from their production lines. The total monthly output of Corsairs alone approached what Japan's entire aviation industry could produce across all aircraft types, and Corsairs represented just one American fighter type among many. The Navy also operated F-6F Hellcats in large numbers. The Army Air Forces deployed P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s by the thousands. Japanese intelligence officers compiled estimates of American aircraft production that seemed impossible until multiple sources confirmed them. America was producing over 90,000 aircraft annually by 1944. Transports, bombers, fighters, trainers, everything aviation warfare required. Japan's peak production year was 1944, with approximately 28,000 aircraft of all types, and that production was already collapsing under bombing and material shortages. The Americans were building aircraft 3 times faster than Japan, and American aircraft were individually superior across nearly every performance metric. Even if Japanese pilots achieved favorable kill ratios, which they increasingly didn't, the mathematics of attrition were unsustainable. Every engagement left Japan proportionally weaker because losses couldn't be replaced while American losses were made good within weeks. The strategic implications extended far beyond tactical aviation. What the Corsair and other American aircraft revealed was the fundamental imbalance between American and Japanese war-making capacity. If America could build fighters this sophisticated in such quantities, then Japan had already lost the industrial war regardless of how many battles remained to be fought. The entire Japanese war plan had rested on assumptions that now appeared tragically flawed. Planners had believed that early victories would give Japan time to consolidate conquests and build defensive positions that would make any American counteroffensive too costly to sustain. They had assumed that after suffering heavy losses, America would negotiate a settlement, leaving Japan controlling most of its conquered territories. The Corsair and the industrial might it represented demolished those assumptions completely. American losses in the Marianas, the Philippines, throughout the island-hopping campaign hadn't slowed the offensive at all. For every carrier aircraft Japan destroyed, 3 more appeared to replace it. For every pilot killed, 2 newly trained aviators arrived from the vast American training pipeline. Senior Japanese officers began contemplating options that had been unthinkable a year earlier. Some advocated for immediate negotiated peace before Japan's situation became completely hopeless. Others pushed for a final decisive battle, one massive engagement that would inflict such catastrophic losses that negotiations might become possible. These debates occurred with everyone understanding that conventional military victory was no longer achievable. By spring 1945, the arithmetic was apocalyptic. Japan had approximately 5,000 aircraft of all types remaining, most obsolete, many grounded for lack of fuel or spare parts. American forces approaching Okinawa could call on thousands of carrier aircraft plus land-based air power from captured island bases. The ratio wasn't just unfavorable, it was hopeless. The Corsair continued its devastating performance through the final year of the war. Marine squadrons VMF-124 and VMF-213 became the first Marine units based on aircraft carriers when they deployed aboard USS Essex in December 1944. The Corsair had finally overcome the carrier landing difficulties that had initially relegated it to land-based operations, and now it could operate from the fast carrier task forces driving toward Japan. Corsairs participated in strikes on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, providing close air support for amphibious operations and air superiority over the invasion beaches. By the Okinawa campaign, nearly every carrier the Navy operated was equipped with Corsairs. The aircraft's versatility as both fighter and fighter-bomber made it invaluable for the grinding attrition of island warfare. The final accounting of the Corsair's combat record validates everything the Japanese had learned about it through bitter experience. The aircraft achieved an 11-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. American pilots flying Corsairs shot down 2,140 Japanese aircraft, while losing only 189 Corsairs to enemy action in air-to-air combat. Another 1,435 Corsairs were lost to anti-aircraft fire or accidents, but the 11-to-1 ratio in aerial combat speaks to overwhelming superiority. For context, the F-6F Hellcat, which was the Navy's primary carrier fighter for most of the war, achieved a 19-to-1 kill ratio. Both aircraft were powered by variants of the same R2-800 engine. Both embodied the same design philosophy of pilot protection, robust construction, and overwhelming firepower. Together, they swept Japanese aviation from Pacific skies. The Zero, by contrast, which had seemed invincible in 1941, became increasingly obsolete as the war progressed. By 1944, it was regarded as outdated, though still capable if operated by trained pilots. The problem was that trained pilots were dying faster than Japan could replace them, and the Zero's lack of protection meant even experienced aviators couldn't survive the weight of fire American fighters delivered. As Japanese aviation collapsed, the Zero found itself relegated to kamikaze operations, fitted with bombs and flown by barely trained pilots on one-way missions. This represented the ultimate failure of the design philosophy that had created it. An aircraft built to showcase pilot skill reduced to a guided missile because Japan had lost so many skilled pilots that suicide attacks became more effective than conventional combat. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, approximately 69,000 troops remained at Rabaul, still garrisoned in the fortress that had been bypassed and forgotten. They had sat out most of the war's final year, isolated and impotent, while American forces advanced to the Japanese home islands. It took the Allies over 2 years to repatriate all the Japanese personnel captured when the garrison finally surrendered. The Corsair would continue in service long after World War II ended. It fought in Korea from 1950 to 1953, where it proved effective in ground attack and close support roles, even as jet fighters took over air superiority missions. Foreign air forces flew Corsairs in colonial conflicts through the 1960s. The last combat missions by Corsairs occurred in July 1969 during the football war between Honduras and El Salvador, nearly 30 years after the aircraft's first flight. From its first combat mission in February 1943 to its final retirement from military service, the Corsair proved one of aviation history's most successful and long-lived fighter designs. Total production exceeded 12,000 aircraft. The distinctive inverted gull wing made it instantly recognizable. The sound of that massive R2-800 engine became known to Japanese soldiers and pilots as the sound of death approaching. But the Corsair's legacy extends beyond kill ratios and production numbers. It represents a case study in how industrial capacity, engineering excellence, and systematic application of resources determine warfare outcomes. The aircraft succeeded not because it was the most maneuverable fighter, or the fastest, or the most elegant. It succeeded because it was designed for the war America was actually fighting rather than the war Japan wished it was fighting. Japan had built fighters optimized for a short, decisive conflict, where limited industrial capacity could produce enough aircraft to achieve air superiority during a brief window. The Zero embodied this philosophy perfectly. Light, maneuverable, long-ranged, designed to maximize performance from limited resources. For 6 months it had worked brilliantly. America built fighters for a long attritional struggle, where industrial might and pilot survivability would ultimately determine victory. The Corsair embodied this philosophy. Heavy, robust, armed to destroy anything it encountered, designed to be manufactured in vast quantities, and to bring pilots home even when damaged. For 3 years, it demonstrated the superiority of this approach. The Japanese engineers who examined captured Corsairs understood what they were seeing. They recognized superior solutions to engineering problems when the evidence sat in front of them. Their technical reports acknowledged American advantages honestly and professionally, but recognition alone couldn't bridge the gap between understanding and implementation. Intelligence only matters if you can act on it. By the time Japan fully understood what the Corsair represented, they lacked the industrial capacity, material resources, and time to respond effectively. The material shortages, industrial bottlenecks, and resource constraints that made Japan unable to match American fighters weren't engineering problems. They were fundamental limitations of Japan's industrial economy that no amount of captured enemy equipment could overcome. There is a broader lesson about technological competition in wartime. Capturing and analyzing enemy equipment is standard practice. Japan's engineers did everything correctly. They were thorough, professional, honest in their assessments. They identified the Corsair's advantages clearly and understood the implications. None of it mattered because understanding why you're losing doesn't help if you lack the means to change the outcome. The 2,000 horsepower of the R2-800 engine, the robust construction that could absorb battle damage, the self-sealing tanks and armor protection, the manufacturing precision and quality control, all of it was beyond Japan's capability to replicate by 1943. The Americans weren't just building better fighters. They had built a better industrial system that could design, produce, and support superior weapons in overwhelming quantities. For the Japanese pilots who faced Corsairs over Rabaul and throughout the Pacific, this technological and industrial superiority translated into a simple reality. They were fighting in aircraft that couldn't protect them against opponents who could engage or disengage at will. No amount of courage, skill, or fighting spirit could overcome the performance differential. The Americans had solved the problem of air superiority through engineering excellence and industrial capacity. When historians examine the Pacific Air War, Rabaul serves as a perfect case study of what happened when fighting spirit met overwhelming material superiority. Japan sent its best, most experienced carrier pilots to defend a crucial strategic position. The Americans arrived with fighters specifically designed to kill everything Japan could field. The result was predictable, brutal, and decisive. The Corsair's 2,000 horsepower outclimbed the Zero's 1,130 horses. American pilots sitting behind 240 pounds of armor couldn't be reliably killed by weapons that shredded unprotected Japanese pilots. 650 caliber machine guns delivered firepower that destroyed Japanese fighters with short bursts. Every engineering decision in the Corsair reflected a philosophy that said pilot lives mattered more than saving weight, that reliability mattered more than squeezing out extra performance, that winning meant building the best tool for the job, regardless of cost. Japan had made different choices, and by November 1943, those choices were coming due. The bill arrived over Rabaul in the form of inverted gull-winged fighters that could do things Zero pilots had thought impossible. Climb rates that matched or exceeded Japanese fighters despite weighing twice as much. Speeds that turned engagements into one-sided slaughter. Durability that brought American pilots home from damage that would have killed their Japanese opponents. The 150-plus Japanese aircraft that deployed to Rabaul during Operation RO represented Japan's answer to the American advance. The F4U Corsairs that arrived weeks later represented America's answer to that answer. 2,000 horsepower, 650 caliber guns, armor and self-sealing tanks, all wrapped in a package that could be built by the hundreds monthly. It wasn't a fair fight. War isn't fair. War is about bringing superior force to bear and destroying the enemy's ability to resist. By March 1944, Japan's ability to resist in the air over Rabaul had been destroyed. The fortress remained garrisoned but impotent, bypassed by an American advance that no longer feared Japanese air power. The elite carrier pilots who were supposed to stop that advance had been systematically killed by fighters they couldn't match and couldn't escape. All the courage and skill in the world hadn't mattered when facing opponents with 2,000 horsepower and the industrial might to build such machines by the thousands. In the end, the story of the Corsair over Rabaul isn't about individual battles or pilot aces, though those are part of it. It's about what happens when two completely different approaches to warfare collide. Japan bet on fighting spirit, pilot skill, and elegance of design. America bet on industrial capacity, engineering excellence, and overwhelming material superiority. The Corsair's performance over Rabaul demonstrated which bet would win. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.